I'm Jonathan Berman, Managing Director of Fieldstone Africa. We're an independent boutique investment bank that gives advice to infrastructure projects in Africa, particularly in the energy sector.
Jonathan, what's the shortfall in energy on the continent?
Well, I suppose it depends how much power you think is required, but to give you an example, South Africa has about 40,000 megawatts of power for nearly 50 million people. The rest of sub-Saharan Africa has 24,000 megawatts of power for 600 to 800 million people. So it's actually one of the biggest infrastructure shortfalls there is.
And I've been working in the telecom sector for over 10 years, and the telecom sector, through deregulation, managed to open up a whole set of services relatively quickly for people. Why is it that the energy sector is so blocked as you look at it as an outsider?
I think a couple of reasons. Firstly, the telecom sector opened up, particularly in cellular, that was just seen as a new business area. And so I think governments and regulators and incumbent utilities have allowed it to progress as a new area. The second reason is that power anywhere in the world it has more monopolistic tendencies. I mean, you can't go directly to your consumer as easily as you can in telecoms. I mean, even in markets like the UK, retail competition for customers, I don't think has really worked out very well. But what you have in markets like the UK is you have, I suppose, more developed wholesale regulation where you can have a monopoly or an oligopoly which is regulated to make sure the consumer still gets well treated. And we haven't really developed that model in Africa yet. We tend to rely on systems heavily dominated by the state entities. Even when those do a very good job, there's a tendency to move at their pace rather than the pace of the market.
And what have been the approaches to liberalisation, and which countries have been ahead of the pack in terms of moving into that field?
Interestingly, it's not always the richest countries or the ones that have the most competitive economies. Uganda's a good example. I mean, Uganda privatized their entire energy industry a number of years ago on a concession basis. And in fact, one of the companies that they privatized, Umemi, which is the electricity distribution company, is now going to be listed publicly in the near future. And so that's quite a radical move. Kenya has moved in a similar direction. The government still owns the majority of the big power utilities, but they're publicly listed. And there are a number of private IPPs, that's kind of private power generators, which have been set up and operate as well.
The big one is really Nigeria, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what has happened there?
Yeah. Well, Nigeria, I mean, officially, there are only about 3,000 megawatts of power on the grid. And there are many times that. The estimate we've heard is 9,000 megawatts of generators running away privately.
So burning diesel into the air.
Burning diesel, so it's expensive, it's environmentally polluted, and it's just not efficient to have that many small generators, even if they were cleaner. So the plan now, and it's currently in process, is for a wholesale privatization of the entire state power sector, distribution, generation, with transmission remaining state-owned but as a more commercial vehicle. That's in process right now. We're working with a number of the bidders for that. We hope it goes through. But the other thing that's happening in Nigeria in some places is industrials are getting together on a smaller scale with the power generation, saying we'll do a deal with you directly. And they won't be that large. They'll be 50 or 100 megawatts, but they
build small generators and sell
generators. But it only really works commercially if it's right next door to an industrial park or something. So you don't need to worry about the state transmission lines or where supply and demand imbalances over time. It's almost a captive deal.
And what's the nature of the problem in terms of meeting this energy demand? I mean, is it a lack of money? Is it a lack of will? Why is things moving so slowly?
In most countries, it's not a lack of fuel supply. In most countries, I mean, Africa is actually blessed with hydro potential, particularly in Central Africa, with gas up and down the west coast, and we've had gas finds in the east coast. With coal in southern Africa, although there are certain countries in between that don't have access to those. So South Africa, for example, has very little hydro capacity, but buys it from its neighbours. So on the energy side, it's willingness to transact with your neighbours. And there's a lot of that, but there's still a degree of suspicion about having your core energy supply sitting in somebody else's country. It's not really financing. I mean, financing, which is what we do for a living, it's not hard to raise the money. It takes time. There are choices that need to be made to get the right mix of financing. But that's partly because not enough projects are being done. I mean, if only a few $1 billion are being done every year across the continent, then you can find that.
And these are big projects, aren't they? They are. You were talking earlier about a project in Kenya costing $5 billion.
Yep. No, they are. And I mean, the Kenyan project, which would cost $5 billion, would only put in about 2,000 megawatts. So it would more than double their capacity, but would still leave them far short of what they're needing. Even in Botswana, which is a very small population, the project we did in Morapuli last year raised $250 million for the coal mine and about $800 million for the power station, and that's just to supply 1.5 million people. Yeah. So yes, the capital needs are huge. In South Africa, 2 new coal-fired power stations, which Eskom, the state utility, are building now, have budgets of about $20 billion each. And there are, so those are things which only really South Africa can do at the moment.
So I return to the question: why is the demand so, if you like, the deal flow so slow, and the meeting the demand so slow?
I think it's because there is an unwillingness to go for wholesale private sector investment. And I mean, that needn't mean privatisation in the sort of classic Western model, but there's a great deal of hesitation about large-scale private sector investment.
And to some extent, the South Africans are an obstacle in this because they sit centrally in southern Africa, and
absolutely, and because the South African model is not one of wholesale privatisation. I mean, we do have a process right now in South Africa. There's a tender out there's a series of tenders out for renewable power plants, all to be built by the private sector. The first round was due to close in June. We're working on one of the first round projects. That's a 100 megawatt wind farm. We are hopeful that will close in the near future. But that, I mean, even if that happens to its full extent, over a few years, that'll only be a few thousand megawatts out of 50,000 in South Africa. So it's actually a fairly small part of the total.
It's marginal, isn't it?
It's marginal. Now, there's a stated policy that 30% of generation in South Africa should be in the hands of the private sector, but it's hard to see how we're going to get there at the moment.
And finally, where then are the investment opportunities in energy in Africa?
Providing one can find the projects that are going to happen on a timely basis, they are everywhere. I mean, South Africa is the best supplied market, but there are still going to be billions of dollars of requirements here. Pretty much everywhere else in the region merits a look. I mean, Nigeria is going through this privatization process. Ghana has already got some private power plants and is doing more. Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania are all doing more. Zambia is doing projects as we speak. Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique. So they are pretty widespread, again, as long as one can find the projects that will happen in a reasonable time frame.
And in policy terms, those private power plants are sort of, in some ways, easier to do maybe than the classic utility simply going out and asking the market for $1 billion or whatever.
Probably they are. I mean, particularly if the utility's balance sheet is not that strong. I mean, a Namibia or South Africa have still relatively strong utility balance sheets, which can borrow commercially. Others, such as Zambia, can borrow with the aid of concessional funding. We did a project in Zambia last year which had a big Chinese export credit, which made it without full government support. In many other countries, though, they're simply not robust enough balance sheets, and then the private solution is required. But even then, the private solution needs an offtake contract from someone. And so it's either got to be that utility or the government backing it up. Yeah,
or a neighbouring country. And you were saying that there are problems with neighbouring countries taking on offtake contracts because of their fears of risk. And
there are some successful examples. I mean, Cahora from Mozambique, which has been, it was set up in the 1970s to sell power to South Africa, and despite decades of disruption during the Civil War, it's been running again since the mid-90s. It sells 2/3 of its capacity to South Africa very successfully. Funnily enough, one of the most interesting ones, little known, is Zimbabwe. The Hwangi power plant in Zimbabwe has for the last few years been selling up to 150 megawatts of power to Namibia. And NamPower invested in that not as an equity cash investment. They basically funded the upgrade of an old power plant and got repaid in power. And that's worked, and that's an example of a country which many outside investors would regard as extremely high risk, but it's actually worked. But I think it was because there was a degree of trust between the two governments and the two utilities that got it done.
Jonathan, thanks for talking to me today.